It's 7 p.m. here in Brisbane, where I'm sitting. So, look, my name's Ian Hall. I'm the acting director of the Griffith Asia Institute here in Brisbane, in Australia, and welcome to this webinar, Enhancing Maritime Security in the Indo-Pacific, that's being hosted by Trobe Asia in conjunction with Griffith Asia Institute. Look, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm speaking today. That's the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to pay respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Well, we're here to kind of celebrate, I suppose. We're here to launch a policy brief. And that was the product of a series of workshops that we held in January and February of 2022. Unfortunately, I don't have a hard copy to hold up in front of you, so I'm just going to share my screen briefly so that it'll give you an indication of what the policy brief looked like. So here it is, the same title as the session that we've got today, Enhancing Maritime Security in the Indo-Pacific, and the product of collaboration between Hilary Briffa and Alessio Patalano at King's College London, Beck Stranding, of course, director of La Trobe Asia, and myself at Griffith Asia Institute. So you can access this policy brief online from the Griffith Asia Institute site and also from La Trobe Asia. Now that brief was the product of, as I said, some workshops that we held earlier on in 2022 with support from the British High Commission in Canberra. And I'd like to thank Diana and Kate, who's on this seminar this evening, as well as Jill in GAI for their work that they did in putting together the workshops and also the brief. So the aim that we've got today is to answer three questions that we discuss in the brief and that we're going to talk about in a bit more detail today. First one is what are the central maritime security challenges in the region, that is the Indo-Pacific. The second one is how are regional states responding to those challenges. And the third issue that we've got to discuss is what are the legal and institutional mechanisms that exist and perhaps should exist in the region to manage their disputes. To explore these questions today, I'm really delighted to be joined by three friends and three participants in earlier dialogues. So they are Hong Lei Tu, who's just now moved to Perth US Asia Centre, where she's the Principal Policy Fellow. Tara Davenport, who's the Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Centre for Environmental Law at the National University of Singapore in Singapore. And Abhijit Singh, who's the Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. So welcome to all three of you. It's a pleasure to be talking this evening to all three. So look, to explore these questions, as I said, we've got three questions to talk about. I'm going to pitch one question to each one of the speakers. And just on housekeeping, the speakers are going to speak on each one of these questions in turn. And then what I'm going to do is open up this session to Q&A. And you can answer those questions either through using the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or alternatively by putting up your hand or indicating somehow or another that you'd like to ask a question, and I'll come to you and ask you to pose your question. All right, so I'm going to start with you, Abhijit, if I may, and I'm going to throw you this first question. So what are, in your view, the key maritime security challenges across the Indo-Pacific region today?
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for that question. Before I start, let me congratulate the La Trobe Griffith Asia Institute and King's College London for this excellent report. I'm assuming it's excellent. I've not gone through it, but I was certainly part of the workshops that were held back in January, and I can say with great certainty that these were very thought-provoking, very lively discussions, and I'm sure some of the findings of those discussions have been captured. The essence of those discussions has been captured in this report. So I'm going to dive straight into the question that Ian posed, and in the interest of time, I'm going to limit myself to three observations. There's for some time been this understanding that the Indo-Pacific region is impacted by both traditional security challenges and non-traditional, the regular ones, the state-on-state security, great power competition on the one hand, and non-traditional security, which is more in the nature of human security challenges, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, constabulary operations, etc. And the understanding that these are two different baskets of challenges. that don't mix very well. They have entirely different dynamics. As I said, one's about fighting a uniformed adversary, the other is about fighting the sea criminal or about providing human security. And that maritime forces must accordingly evolve different strategies to deal with these different challenges. But what's happened over the past few years is that there's been what's popularly now called as gray zone challenges. These are threats that lie in the nether zone. It's neither this nor that. It has dimensions of both. It's sort of a dual edge. And what we're seeing is that on the Pacific side, there are maritime militias. On the Indian Ocean side, in the Western Indian Ocean, there's the rise of maritime terrorism. But what I'd say is that something that has escaped notice is what's happening in the Eastern Indian Ocean, which is that there are Chinese quasi-military ships in terms of research and survey vessels, in terms of intelligence vessels, even I would say some fishing fleet that are, pardon me, even some fishing fleet that are actually gathering intelligence in this region. And that means that the Indian Ocean is faced with a very different kind of gray zone threat that really doesn't get talked about enough. The second issue that must be pointed out is the growing salience of actually non-traditional security threats. This is where the real demand for security is coming in the region in terms of capacity building to deal with illegal fishing, maritime pollution, climate change challenges, forced migration, etc. And the trouble really that nations and the navies are really facing is that the essential model of maritime security cooperation remains structured around traditional security. The threat of China, that's what is driving the real the cooperation in the region. And the truth is that if we look at some of the maritime developments in the recent past, such as the Quad Malabar, all the 4 Quad countries participating in the Malabar exercises, or for that matter, AUKUS. Again, that this is a move by the US, UK, and Australia to share strategic technologies, particularly submarine technology, or even the MDA, the Indo-Pacific MDA initiative that's been undertaken recently. They are all actually focused on the China challenge. And the other challenges that lie in the non-traditional security domain, such as overfishing or resources management or pollution, all of these challenges are really a footnote in that essential narrative of maritime security cooperation. It's traditional security that is driving all the cooperation. Now, I might just state here as an aside and take just one more minute because I know my time is running out, that India has a complicated relationship with China. And for a long time, there was this understanding that a military-centric approach is going to be enough to keep the Chinese at bay in the Indian Ocean region, but that has not worked out very well. There is a growing appreciation of the fact that the countries in the region, what they demand is more cooperation on non-traditional security issues, and therefore a more composite strategy is needed in the region. So I'm going to stop by saying this, that for all the emphasis on the rules-based order, there is still less clarity on what exactly will be the nature of cooperation that is needed to deal with both the Chinese threat, the threat of China in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean, and on the other hand, also deal with non-traditional security challenges, because every country has a different way in which it defines these challenges. And going forward, I think it's going to be important to empathize with each other's needs, each other's understanding of maritime security, and draw a sort of a balance between the need to counter the China challenge, as also take into consideration the different elements of security when it comes to non-traditional security challenges. And I'm going to stop here.
Wonderful, thanks so much, Abhijit. Characteristically incisive and direct, and that takes us also very helpfully to the second question, which I'm going to throw to you, Huang Lei, too. So, look, how are regional states responding? How are they acting to defend this regional rules-based order or otherwise? And how are they acting, in other words, in response to these various different challenges that Abhijit has outlined?
Thank you, Ian, for those questions, and great to be with everyone. And I share Abhijit's sentiments that the previous workshop were really excellent. I'm pleased to be a part of this webinar as well, and good to see many familiar faces in the audience as well, familiar names in the audience as well. So before I answer Ian's question about regional responses, and may I premise that I will be focusing mainly on Southeast Asia, just because that's my area of interest, but also just because I came back from 2 months there, so I have a little bit more of fresh perspective. I think Albit's the division was very helpful. I will also frame it in two kind of way. That one basket, you might call it old, ongoing, and persistent challenges, to which the regional countries have some sort of existing framework how to approach them, not necessarily always working very efficiently, but those are the areas that the regional multilateral mechanism have been focusing on for a number of decades already, and those are traditional maritime disputes, fisheries, piracies, the well-known challenges, and persisting ones that are long-term. And we have ASEAN-centered architecture around them, where be them ASEAN Regional Forum, ADM, and plus being ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, or ASEAN Maritime Forum, and so on. The other basket is so-called more new and more kind of emerging threats, but they equally can be ongoing and persistent as well. And not necessarily we have all the existing framework to address them already, because they are new, and because of the inherent limits of those multilateral framework that tend to be slow, tend to be inclusive, but also very, very big, and so very have limits in the effectiveness. And those new challenges are often requiring much more timely approach, and much more targeted or tailored approaches, be them, for example, cyber-enabled threats, or supply chain of critical goods, such as oil, gas, food, and other things that we are experiencing right now. But I would also say that they are intertwined. They're not completely separate. We also see one reinforcing another in terms of mounting challenges. And oftentimes there's no one challenge that the countries need to respond to, but many at the same time. So in terms of responses that Ian asked me, I think there are a range of responses, and there's no one solution that is prevalent across the region to those many challenges, and not even a clear leading preferences, I would say, except maybe, you know, there is a very much fashionable and talk about minilateralism propelled by Quad and AUKUS, and more or less in big announcements such as submarine announcements with AUKUS, or plans or even imaginary plans about potential joint patrol on the Quad, or other coordinated deployment of tech equipment like satellite that may assist monitoring of the maritime domain and whatnot. And so there is a lot of enthusiasm about those new unilateral framework that are more exclusive in nature, allegedly more effective because of that, and more tailored, and in a way are selective of the members that have more or less coordinatable capacities, or have more similar views to the threat. When it comes to the bigger region, and even in Southeast Asia, because the recognition of threats is so different from country to country, it's very hard to coordinate. And it's even harder because of the different capabilities and resources. So the fact that countries recognize different threats, different level of severity and urgency, make it challenging to make the multilateralism work. So for now, my own assessment is that multilateralism become a habit, a diplomatic practice, a space for deliberating, rather really a space for actionable plans. So there are a lot of threat and challenges are being responded individually. And I think the effect of the war in Ukraine, as well as China's continuous zero COVID policy, causing disruption and backlogs in supply chain of critical goods such as oil, gas, and causing food prices soar, make it many countries in the region make food security and other so-called non-traditional security main preoccupation right now. And you have countries including Indonesia that even go to the extent of saying, let's not discuss about China. We don't want to talk about those well-known threats anymore. And they prefer, a lot of countries prefer to play down those security challenges, including China's provocations, be them in or the increased activities in the maritime militia, for example. And that plays to the Beijing's tactics that it targets often individual countries rather than collective. So that sort of prevents a coordinated or collective response. And that is also an effect of China's assertiveness in the South China Sea in particular had become so-called old news. So nobody is being outraged anymore. It's to a degree normalized, even it's not making as much news anymore, and effectively disarming the public response. So, and that's what China wanted. It is not happening all the time and across, of course, different countries, Vietnam being very still strong on that, but I think it is losing the headline space that it used to have, right? The Ukraine war, I think, brought a lot of anxiety too. So there's a political factor there, that the risk, and the countries in the region realize that the risk of war is no longer an imaginary, and geopolitical tensions are very tangible. So there is a little bit of also desire to lower the temperature in the region and not playing up too much into the risk of further escalation, at least diplomatically. I think the political factor will still be there one way or another. But for example, one of the latest news was that the US has withdrawn from the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting on counterterrorism, which is not necessarily, something particular sensitive, but that was because it was chaired by Myanmar and it was happening in Moscow. So the challenge to the ASEAN style of multilateralism will be there, and that will be a political one. And to what degree we will have a broader regional multilateral responses or coordination in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to be really much on political factor. And equally, individual countries as well, you see that in the Philippines with the change of leadership. So it will be up to the Marcos Jr. administration, for example, how they go about the arbitral tribunal ruling from 2016. And that will, of course, have impact on the whole region, and that will be predetermined collective approach to the regional dispute management, for example. So what I'm trying to say here is that we have a plethora of challenges and different options of responses, but I would underline, highlight the political factor behind it, because they will determine the choices, the preferences at the end of the day, where resources and commitment are being put in most cases. I think my time is up, so I'll yield the microphone to Tara. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It is an absolutely impossible task to ask you to cover a huge region, and it's so many varied responses to what is happening in quick time as well. But thank you so much. And to do all of that in less than 10 minutes is absolutely impossible, as I suggest. But Tara, I'm going to kind of do a similar thing to you as well. In terms of the regional mechanisms that we have for dispute resolution, can you give us a sense of what they are, of what's lacking, of what might be, and so on? So Tara Davenport, it's over to you. And then after that, we're going to have questions, and you can ask your questions at the bottom of the screen. There's a question and answer box there. and I will read those questions out. So Tara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, great. Again, I must echo the thanks of Abhijit and Huang. Delighted to be here and delighted to have participated in the earlier seminars, which were very lively. I am talking about the legal mechanisms that exist to manage or resolve ongoing disputes. And I would like to start off by saying that from international law perspective, there is no widespread consensus on what is meant by maritime security. And indeed, the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, there are very few references to maritime security. And of course, because of this, scholars, policymakers, and government officials have tended to identify existing or future threats to maritime security and what needs to be taken to address such threats. And I think Huang and Abhijit have basically addressed that very well. For this region, and again, both have been, this has been addressed by the previous speakers, there exist several maritime security threats from a variety of sources. But because of my own individual interest, I wanted to focus on the interstate dimension of maritime security concerning sovereignty disputes and overlapping maritime claims and the potential legal mechanisms that can be used to resolve or manage such disputes. As we all know, Southeast Asia has a very complex maritime geography, and nearly all Southeast Asian waters are enclosed as territorial seas, EEZs, or archipelagic waters. There's a complex coastal configuration, complicated with gulfs that penetrate deeply, and there are a multitude of large and small islands, some of which are subject to sovereignty disputes. While the territorial sovereignty disputes over the Spratly and the Paracel Islands in the South China Sea, and the sort of consequent disputes over maritime entitlement are, I would say, a primary source of tension in the Southeast Asian region. Again, I'm also only focusing on Southeast Asia. It is not the only area of uncertainty or potential conflict. There are other maritime areas which have not been delimited for various reasons and can also be a source of escalating tensions between states in the region. These unresolved maritime entitlement issues have implications for maritime security because, of course, activities by other states in these undelimited areas can strain relations, but also pose an impediment to cooperation on maritime security threats posed by non-state actors, including piracy, terrorism, and maritime transnational organized crime. I will focus very briefly, hopefully, on three legal mechanisms, which are by no means exhaustive. Number one, third-party binding dispute settlement. Number two, third-party non-binding dispute settlement. And lastly, international agreements, which can be either binding or non-binding. With regards to third-party dispute settlement, right, as I'm sure the audience is familiar with, sovereignty disputes can only be resolved by international courts and tribunals if states agree to submit to such disputes to international courts and tribunals. And while we have had examples of such sovereignty disputes being submitted and complied with in the region, such as the Singapore-Malaysia dispute over Petra Branca and Middle Rocks, and the Indonesia-Malaysia dispute over Ligatan and Sipadan, I do not see such a complex sovereignty dispute over the South China Sea features being submitted by agreement to an international court or tribunal anytime in the immediate future. Of course, it's a very complex dispute, arose over, who knows when the dispute crystallized. And again, it makes bilateral dispute settlement challenging, leaving such sovereignty issues. And this is compounded by the fact that leaving such sovereignty issues to international courts and tribunals, which have been elevated to symbols of national identity with a focus on binary outcomes, it's a very unattractive solution. UNCLOS, of course, has established a robust compulsory dispute settlement system over any dispute relating to the interpretation or application of UNCLOS. UNCLOS courts and tribunals will not decide sovereignty disputes in principle, but disputes relating to maritime entitlement, maritime delimitation, and activities in contested areas could be subject to UNCLOS compulsory dispute settlement, provided that none of the compulsory or optional exceptions apply. In particular, Article 298 allows states to opt out of disputes relating to maritime boundary delimitation, as well as military activities. In the Southeast Asian region, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand have excluded disputes falling under Article 298 from compulsory dispute settlement. And in the East Asian region, both China and Korea This may limit the utility of UNCLOS dispute settlement mechanisms, of course, subject to the caveat, if you have very good international lawyers who are able to frame the issue in a way in which the International Court of Tribunal will accept jurisdiction. I have 5 minutes left. I will go on. I have to speak briefly, of course, about the South China Sea arbitration brought by the Philippines against China, which China did not participate in. This has often been used as an example of the inherent deficiencies of international law and third-party dispute settlement. But as I've argued elsewhere, and even in the previous seminar, the value of adversarial dispute settlement goes beyond compliance and includes clarifying legal issues, serving as a process for disputing states to clarify and examine their own claims and articulate them in a legal manner. And of course, decisions of international courts and tribunals have also been used as focal points and leveraged by other actors. I will now briefly go on to third-party non-binding dispute settlement. And when I refer to third-party non-binding dispute settlement, I'm referring to processes which involve mediators or conciliators, whereby the report by the mediator or conciliator is basically an attempt to impartially examine disputes and an attempt to define terms of settlement that may be accepted by parties. But again, this is a non-binary outcome. Parties are free to reject the report. The Australia-Timor-Leste conciliation, which was unilaterally brought by Timor-Leste against Australia, is under UNCLOS, is often touted as a successful example of conciliation, as the conciliators were highly skilled and able to really understand the interests and needs of the parties and come up with an agreement that was acceptable to both. The prospect of compulsory conciliation under UNCLOS being used to resolve some of the disputes in Southeast Asia may be limited because of the specific requirements in the law of the Sea Convention. But of course, voluntary conciliation, whereby both parties agree to conciliation, still remains a useful dispute settlement mechanism. Lastly, I want to briefly talk about international agreements, right? Of course, these are international, they are international conventions or treaties. And I wanted to really highlight the active boundary diplomacy that has taken place in Southeast Asia. Between 1969 and 2019, there were 32 delimitation agreements where a boundary was agreed upon, and 12 provisional arrangements, which were sort of agreed upon pending a boundary agreement. And these include joint development arrangements, joint seismic arrangements, and conflict management agreements. Some of them are not in force at the moment, and not all of them met with equal degrees of success, but that is an option that remains, particularly for states which are not ready to resolve maritime delimitation. And of course, both maritime delimitation agreements and provisional arrangements require extensive negotiations, a political will, a lot of consensus between parties, and there are also inherent difficulties with that. And maritime delimitation agreements in particular are predicated on sovereignty disputes being decided. Lastly, I wanted to talk about non-binding agreements. And again, there are some non-binding arrangements which also exist to manage tensions. These include the ASEAN-China Declaration on the Code of Conduct. Right now, there are current negotiations on the Code of Conduct. There is the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea and the China-US Memorandums of Understanding. And of course, again, with varying degrees of success. And much emphasis has been placed on the non-binding nature of these instruments and that they are not really legal instruments or law per se, although I would sort of beg to disagree. And I would also say that these instruments also have a very useful role to play, particularly in these ancillary issues that arise from maritime entitlement disputes, right? They serve, I'm preaching to the choir here, they serve as confidence building measures, right, which reduce uncertainties and build confidence. And I think also I'm very interested in processes. The processes in negotiating such instruments are also very important. Officials meet, they're able to communicate their national positions, and they may sometimes, depending on the situation at hand, serve as benchmarks for acceptable behavior and ultimately form a way of nudging states into complying with the rule of law. So I think I'll end there by saying, but there are of course legal mechanisms, an array of legal mechanisms available to enhance maritime security. But I would say that not all maritime security issues are amenable to legal solutions, and that we should not view the law as a panacea to the problems that the region is facing. Thank you.
Tara, thank you so much. It's been fantastic in having you involved this evening, but also so more broadly in the project. And I think all three of the speakers today have given an indication of the kind of the flavor of the sessions that we had earlier on in the year, which brought together experts in security, as well as political and diplomatic specialists, and of course, international lawyers into the broad discussion, and really enriched that discussion as we went along through those 4 sessions. And we hope to have done all of that justice in the report that we've published just recently. So look, we've got time now for some questions and some comment and so on from the audience. What I'd like to invite you to do is to type up your question in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen. If you just click on that, you can open it up and ask the question. So I'm going to address those questions one by one, if I may. The first question is a specific one, but it goes to what Huang was talking about Southeast Asian states and how they are sitting in terms of not just their perceptions of China, which is and the United States, which you mentioned in your comments, but also of some of these new mechanisms that have emerged in the last few years, specifically the Quad. And so there's a question there from Lin Ha about the Southeast Asian perceptions of the Quad, and asking specifically about Vietnam, but in your response, I'd invite you to to speak more broadly than that. And the question also references some research that you did, Huang, a few years ago, so in 2018. I know there's been some more recent surveys done. I know William Chong and others have published some more recent surveys of Southeast Asian opinion, but I'm going to pitch that question to you now. So Southeast Asian perceptions of the Quad and minilateralism more broadly, Huang.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you for Ling for the question. Yes, I think that's one of the most quoted and probably most comprehensive to date study on the Quad and Southeast Asian perceptions. I'm glad it's after 4 years it's still making around, and recently also there have been references to it. I think it's high time for me to do another round of more updated research, given that the Quad has also evolved since then. But to answer Ling's question, yes, I think it's not surprising at all that Vietnam, in the study you referenced that I authored, was so enthusiastic about the Quad, and equally Philippines was quite enthusiastic. Of course, depending what you mean by interest, right? The government's interest. As you know, the Vietnamese government is not very vocal in many issues, including the Quad or AUKUS or other regional issues, and doesn't make much of commentary or public statement, that rather than very neutral and minimal ones. So you wouldn't see from official statements the interest, and if you by interest you mean an interest of joining, then of course that wouldn't be the case. But Vietnam did attend a number of Quad Plus meetings, so it was quite active in that space. And of course, you know, there are always hopes for, probably now is different and moderated, but when it resurfaced, when the Quad resurfaced, Quad 2.0, I would say, there was a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of anticipation of what it would do in a space of traditional security, for example, of you know, rules-based order, what role it will have because of the rhetoric around it, and also its role in law-binding issues, because other regional mechanisms, including ASEAN and including that Tara mentioned, DOC or COC, or ongoing negotiations with COC, have been not really effective. So a mechanism that could bring more enforcing mechanisms, that an initiative like Quad brought a lot of hopes. And another, I think, pointer to this study is that it was an anonymous survey. It was a combination of interviews and surveys. So people were more inclined to express their own view rather than quotable official statements. So that's why you might see the difference.
Thank you. Look, can I maybe just also ask Tara this question and just slightly reframe this a little bit? From the perspective of where you're sitting in Singapore, Singapore's been involved as well in some of these kind of plus initiatives, and obviously has close and rather interesting relationships with the various major powers in the in the region as well. Do you think that this trend towards multilateralism is helpful in terms of moving us towards dispute resolution or not? I know that's a really difficult question to pitch to you, Tara, but I'm going to pitch that to you right now.
It's a very interesting question. Towards dispute resolution, I'm not sure. You know, I will give the lawyer's answer, which is depends on the circumstances. But I think that there is a general I mean, you know, it sounds so trite to say, you know, the ASEAN way. There's a general aversion to sort of binding dispute settlement mechanisms. I'm not sure, as you know, the multilateralism is sort of going to nudge us in that direction. I think that there is, I mean, you know, Huang talked about sort of the ineffectiveness or the perception of ineffectiveness of the DOC and the COC. But I sort of still maintain that these are really important processes, you know, and, you know, ASEAN still, I believe, well, I guess my optimism is being eroded steadily, but I still believe that it remains a viable platform for discussions between the ASEAN states and the ASEAN claimant states and China. But I think it's also important to remember that, you know, the South China Sea disputes are only, you know, not all ASEAN member states are involved. This idea of consensus sort of always sort of hinders a common position on the South China Sea being agreed upon by ASEAN. So it has its inherent limitations, but also plays a useful role. I feel like I'm like the sort of naive eternal optimist in this discussion. But yeah, to answer your question, I would say I think that it is going to, well, I might have to eat my hat, but I think it might be unlikely that we actually see third-party binding dispute resolution, particularly in relation to the South China Sea disputes. I think the appetite for that has sort of died out a bit. And again, in many ways, there's a sort of perception that the legal issues have been resolved by the South China Sea Tribunal. So we have to sort of explore other ways now to resolve and manage these disputes.
Brilliant, thank you,
Can I
Tara.
just add a bit to?
Yes, of course, Abhijit.
Thanks. No, I mean, I'm actually compelled by what Tara and Wong have both pointed out. But let me just say this with regard to, you know, organizations like the ADMM Plus and to a degree, the Quad also. Look, the fact is that the ADMM Plus actually, as an organization, structured around non-controversial, you know, non-traditional challenges. And so when it comes to issues like, and these challenges, by the way, you know, non-traditional challenges are tactical challenges. They are in the moment. So whether it's anti-piracy or it's armed robbery, or for that matter, you know, IUU fishing, which is illegal, unreported fishing in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. These are uncontroversial because most participants in that organization would agree that there is a problem in these areas and that we need to work together. But this does not produce any long-lasting synergy. So when it comes to disputes, as Tara was pointing out, you know, territorial disputes, they remain in their place. No country shifts its positions. And I would be very surprised if the Chinese would feel any pressure from an organization like the ADMM Plus. So for that matter, even if the Chinese were cooperating in a certain initiative, that cooperation does not point to a change of heart in the traditional realm. So they would continue to hold their positions. And in fact, in the case of Taiwan, as we have seen, there was a recent statement by a Chinese official to say that the Taiwan Strait is basically a Chinese, you know, it's Chinese internal waters. This is China's territorial waters. So they are not in any way tamping down on their claims. And it would be foolhardy to believe that what we do in terms of non-traditional security will somehow, you know, indicate to China that we are willing to push them to accept our version of what the South China Sea should look like, and a South China Sea that is free of Chinese coercion and Chinese aggression. That is the big conundrum that we face, and this holds true also with regard to the Quad, wherein the kind of cooperation we are doing is essentially tactical cooperation. Yes, we have better interoperability. Yes, we have better habits of cooperation. We are doing many more exercises. But I say until we don't have integrated operations of the kind that happens in the CMF, combined maritime forces, the CTF 151, the 152, where you do sustained operations together. You're using similar equipment, you have similar protocols, similar norms. You cannot develop that kind of interoperability that will help you in deterring an adversary. And if China is that adversary, then I'm afraid this kind of cooperation that is more in rhetorical and more that happens, periodically and episodical, is not going to be enough to push back China. That is the problem that we face, that we make so much of hype about our cooperation, but really in material terms, we are nowhere close to pushing back against the Chinese assertion and activity in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean region. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Abhijit. I've got another question here for you. So I'm going to come back to you, and then I'm going to come back to the other members of the panel. So this is really a question about China's behavior, and particularly China's use of gray zone approaches in order to get what it wants in a variety of spaces, whether that's the East China Sea or indeed whether that's along the line of actual control or in the South China Sea. So the question is a quite specific one. Why is China using approaches that are normally more characteristic of weaker states in these contexts? What does it hope to gain, and why is it selecting these strategies?
Well, China's strategy is a really smart one. And I tell you why. If you were to use military forces, then a nation really is creating the rationale for the opponent to use the military back in turn. What the Chinese are really doing is that they're using instruments that are very hard to classify as military. There is this large sense that they are meant to, in some ways, undermine Chinese adversaries or presumed adversaries. But you can never put your finger on whether these are really military instruments or not. And when the Chinese use military maritime militias, for example, in the South China Sea, Beijing always has plausible deniability to say that, well, what happened in those waters was just a tactical response. The fishing boat felt threatened by your Coast Guard ship, and therefore it went and rammed that ship. This is not as if this was commandeered by a Chinese, Coast Guard officer, or this was taking orders from the Chinese military. This is simply a reaction to what was happening in those waters. So as a result of this, China takes away the rationale for another state to use force in return. And this is a very smart move because it keeps the Chinese military and it keeps the Chinese Coast Guard out of the scene of action, and it allows other instruments to apply force or to push back presumed opponents. I might point out the Chinese are trying similar tactics in the Indian Ocean region, as I pointed out in my initial comments. The Chinese Coast Guard, not just Coast Guard, but the survey vessels, the research vessels, their mining ships, intelligence ships, are all in India's EEZs, as for that matter, in the EEZs of other countries, to send a signal to India and other countries in the region that Chinese presence in these waters is par for the course, and that it should be accepted because all big powers have interests in far-flung out zones, maritime zones, and it's not extraordinary for Chinese to have for China to have presence in these waters. And so again, it shifts the needle, a very quietly and surreptitiously. It shifts the balance of power in China's direction. So I would think this is a very smart strategy, and we need an equally calibrated and nuanced strategy to counter China when it uses maritime militias and gray zone instruments.
Thank you, Abhijit. That's a very clear analysis of the problem, I think, and a very sort of convincing piece of analysis as far as I'm concerned as to what China is up to and why. We've got a question here, and I might come back to you, Huang, and then to you, Tara, about ASEAN centrality, this phrase that we hear all the time. It's one of those phrases in Southeast Asia which means slightly different things, I think, to different people in different countries across the region. But it's also something which has been repeatedly affirmed by statements that are made by the Quad grouping and also by individual diplomats and leaders from the major powers in the region as well. So to you, Huang, what does ASEAN centrality mean today, and what is its future as we look to a whole range of other mechanisms for managing some of the problems that we've got in the region?
Impossible question to answer, Ian. But let me just quickly add on the maritime militia before I go to that one. Is that, yes, exactly that deniability, because China can or still claim good neighborhood policy, be in talks about the code of conduct with the neighbors, and claim good relationship with the region. The moment it uses its official PLA navy, it will, become an aggressor, right? But with the maritime militia and tactics, if you talk to people in the maritime domain, where the Coast Guards and others in the region, they will tell you the tactics deployed are really very sophisticated, and oftentimes they're disguised as fishermen, they're disguised as with Vietnamese flag, Filipino flag, Indonesian flag. So that gives a room for deniability there, and cause even bigger stir among countries, because it will confuse everyone at the same time. The question about ASEAN centrality, I think ASEAN centrality is becoming a mantra, but something that for a number of decades now, I think countries have not clearly defined or figured out for themselves. It means different things at different point of time. Recently, in the context of unilateralism emerging like Quad or AUKUS or others, it rather points to the challenge of ASEAN centrality. Not that we were ever on the same page about ASEAN centrality within ASEAN itself, and not that ASEAN countries are not familiar with unilateralism themselves. There are a number of, we have to make that distinction, that it's not just new unilateralism like Quad that is challenging multilateralism like ASEAN. Minilateralism and multilateralism coexisted for a long time, and they were fine. And a lot of countries, member states of ASEAN, have been and are members of other unilaterals. So there's no inherent problem there. It's a question of other emerging regional focal points, if not architecture, that for some would challenge that ASEAN centrality, or ASEAN being at the central of all regional architecture. So I think that's an important distinction to make. I think, there was a time that ASEAN did show more of initiatives and activism in terms of regional diplomacy. Now we see whether AUKUS or Quad or other trilaterals in the region across Indo-Pacific, meaning ASEAN is not the only game anymore. And there are other maybe competing, but not necessarily competing, because they have a different function as well. So I think for ASEAN needs to work out the relationship with the new initiatives, whether it likes it or not. And it needs to be relevant by not by the virtue of absence of other institutions, right? That's a wrong assumption. And ASEAN centrality is not guaranteed by absence of Quad or AUKUS or anything else. If ASEAN can assert a centrality, it should be able to assert despite of proliferating new initiatives. And I think what we're seeing now is that challenge being perceived externally but it's also pointing to the internal weakness of ASEAN and perhaps the crisis of confidence within ASEAN itself. So, you know, I'm an ASEAN observer for a long time, and I've been supportive for ASEAN a long time too, but I do recognize that there is this internal crisis of confidence within, and without that being resolved, I think whether Quad or any other initiative will always be seen as something that challenges ASEAN centrality.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to throw this one to Tara. I'm going to note as well, we've got 10 minutes left. If anybody's got any further questions, please do type them up in the Q&A. If the question doesn't come forward, I'm going to ask the panel one final one about China, and especially about the leadership issues in China and what that might lead to post 2023 and the leadership transition that's coming up. So Tara, can I ask you just to comment on the ASEAN centrality question? Abhijit, do feel free to jump in if you like on that issue, and then we might round up with just one more question before we finish at 8 p.m. Brisbane time. So Tara, ASEAN centrality.
Sorry, ASEAN centrality. Can I be really intellectually lazy and say that I completely agree with Huang and what she said? And I think her comments are really spot on. And I think that perhaps we expect too much of ASEAN. And I think, I mean, relating to the questions of Quad and ASEAN, I think they're very different beings, that they're very they serve very different functions. And I've noticed with ASEAN that there is on sort of these low-hanging fruits, you know, sort of like trade, economy, and I mean, even in the protection of the marine environment, there's actually been a lot of work done. And, you know, they may be statements, you know, you can say that they're useless, but, you know, there's still the programs of action. They set out like a course of action for ASEAN member states. And I think that ASEAN still definitely has a valuable role to play in regionalism and enhancing regionalism, maybe not so much in sort of the more sensitive issues relating to maritime security and the South China Sea disputes. But ASEAN centrality in other issues, I would say, is still arguably there. But I agree with Huang and exactly what she said about they are going through an internal sort of crisis of confidence on you know, being challenged by these various unilateral initiatives. But again, I mean, what do we really want ASEAN to be, right? What do we are we expecting too much of it, right? It's a regional organization and in which they issue a lot of declarations and statements. And it's really a way to enhance cooperation between ASEAN member states, right? And I think that if we sort of reframe what we hope ASEAN to be, then perhaps we won't be so disappointed by it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Tara. Okay, I don't have any other questions from the audience, so I'm going to ask one really difficult one. We're going up to a party congress in China. We could be looking at and we probably are looking at a third term for Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's period in power has been marked by a shift to a much more assertive posture across the region from China. And of course, it's also been accompanied by an astonishing rate of growth in the Chinese Navy, Chinese Coast Guard, as well as the maritime militias and the fishing fleets and so on and so forth. So just in a minute each, please, what would a third term for Xi Jinping mean then for maritime security across the region, if it's even possible to answer that question? Abhijit, I'm going to be mean and go to you first.
Yeah, well, I'd say that a third term for President Xi Jinping would mean that, essentially mean that the status quo in the South China Sea, and I would say across the Indo-Pacific region, would sustain for another few years. I think under Xi Jinping, whatever his domestic policies may have been, and this is a question that that only the analysts that look at China's internal politics will really be able to answer whether that's been good for China or not. I personally think that this is that the issue is controversial. There's a few things that he's done that's not quite been in the interest of the Chinese people. But as far as maritime security is concerned, I think China has a better sense of what its position is in the region and in the world. And if you look at the militarization of the Chinese Navy, as well as the Chinese Coast Guard in terms of the assets that they're now getting. And I'm talking not just destroyers and frigates, and for that matter, even the aircraft carrier, but also, high-tech submarines, the fact that the Chinese now have a sort of a space program. They're much more secure when it comes to using cyber technologies. So China knows that it is a power to reckon with. And I think pushing China back in the Indo-Pacific space, especially in the South China Sea, is going to take quite some doing. I'm not surprised that the Americans are now talking about militarizing the South China Sea in their own way. They're talking about gunboat diplomacy that's going to happen, because they realize that convincing China to go with the legal mechanisms, etc., UNCLOS is not going to work in the long run. This is going to be a much more contested dynamic going forward if Xi Jinping were to continue. So for maritime security, this is not good news. But in the Indian Ocean, might I just point out, I'll just take half a minute, there's going to be a very different game playing out. And that's because we've got to realize that that China under Xi Jinping has two different strategies for the Indo and for the Pacific. For the Pacific, it is much more contested. It's full spectrum dominance of the Western Pacific and the South China Sea. In the Eastern Indian Ocean and in the Indian Ocean at large, it's more about stakeholdership and incremental stakeholdership. The Chinese are going to be bigger stakeholders. They're going to project themselves as developmental partners, security providers. And there it's going to be hard for India again to counter China, because if the Chinese are going to come in saying that they're going to, provide the security goods and provide the developmental goods, how can India make the case that that this presence is bad for the region and that the Chinese should be kept out? So the challenges that the Indo side is going to face in President Xi Jinping's third term, I'm quite certain are going to be very different from the challenges that the Pacific is going to face. But if India has to develop, as I said, a composite strategy to counter China, we're going to have to take some of the issues of regional countries in the Pacific into consideration in the devising of that strategy to deter China in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. I'm going to stop here. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Huang, I'm going to throw it to you next.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, this is the question, I think, with trillions of dollars, not even million, but trillions, if not more. I think I'm not sure you agree from Hanoi's perspective with Abhijit that there will be status quo in the South China Sea. I think Vietnam would worry that under the third term of Xi Jinping, China will continue to advance its maritime interests, will continue on the mission of militarization and advancing capabilities in the artificial outpost and have a certain greater control or ability to do so. So I think what already has been ongoing for a number of years will only continue and intensify. And that includes the maritime militia that we've discussed as well. So I think there isn't that confidence from Vietnam in particular, but also a number of other claimant states that things will be calm or stable. But I think there is a point to a level of predictability. So we've known Xi Jinping's rule for 2 terms. We've heard many policy and announcements, including the global security initiatives. So that carefully studying that there is a level of very clearly stated objective of China, how it wants to assert that order in the region. So there is level of predictability there, and optimists may want to believe that Xi Jinping's third term will not necessarily seek unnecessary provocation or dangerous ones. But I think there are also other beyond the maritime. I think for countries in Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia in particular, there's also other worry in Mekong as a second frontier, not necessarily maritime and not necessarily receiving as much global attention, including the legal ones, because it doesn't have as many legal support and provisions like the maritime domain, and not global interest in there, but it is increasingly a point of concern, and including, potential plans or potential rumors that China may have access to Cambodia's port in Ream, which will really change the balance of power and shake the whole, make the whole mainland Southeast Asia worry. So it's not necessarily maritime, but it's not disconnected either.
Thank you very much. Tara, last thought on the leadership transition in Beijing.
Oh, well, thank you for asking me last, because I can now borrow the thoughts of Abhijit and Huang. But I mean, honestly, it's beyond my expertise. But I can, sort of from a lawyer's perspective or on an external observer, I can definitely agree with what both Abhijit and Huang have said. Either the maintenance of status quo and or a strengthening of positions in relation to various issues in the South China Sea, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And even with a new leadership, I don't think that would change. I think it's become so intertwined with Chinese nationalist rhetoric. It's very difficult to step down from that.
Well, everybody, look, we're out of time. I think we've given an indication of how lively and broad-ranging and indeed authoritative the discussions that we had earlier on in the year are. And if anybody's interested in these issues, then please do either keep up with what Beck Stratting and the team and so on are doing at La Trobe Asia, and what we're trying to do at Griffith Asia Institute, as well as what our participants have been doing as well. Look, I'd just like to thank the three of you for the discussion this evening. It's been a pleasure talking to all three of you. I'd also like to thank the team at La Trobe Asia, Diana, Hedrick and Kate Clayton for managing this event this evening. And I'd like to thank you in the audience for your questions and also your participation, and for listening in to us and taking an interest in what we've been doing here. And I will bid you all good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.